from Greg Sheridan, foreign editor at the Australian newspaper. Greg, thank you for joining me. We always knew this would be high-stakes politics for Boris Johnson once he got the job and embarked on this push for deal or no deal Brexit. What have you made about what happened, though, overnight? Losing control of the parliament, losing his majority, but not backing down.
This is fantastic, David. This is the best story in the world. It's even better than Trump for the moment. And I think Boris Johnson hasn't put a foot wrong so far. If, as your previous speaker was saying, he filibusters the legislation in the Lords, then Parliament is prorogued, and that's it. It's all over, Red Rover, because they don't come back until October 14 when they've got the Queen's speech, and that takes a couple of days. And whatever legislation they pass, he can delay it again in the Lords, and he can just run the clock down to October 31. But isn't this a magnificent irony, David? Last week, Boris Johnson, according to not only the far left of British politics, but the establishment, the Financial Times and The Economist and so on, was a jackbooted Nazi, a charlatan, a demagogue, a tin pot dictator, because he was going to prorogue Parliament for 4 extra days. But now, this week, he wants an election. Very unusual thing for a dictator to actually want an election to put themselves before the people. And all of those same people who were screaming that outrage last week are saying, no, 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 we mustn't have an election because guess what? He might win it. And then we will actually leave the EU after all. And that's what they're all really concerned about. They couldn't give tuppence about the so-called constitutional proprieties. Now, it's not guaranteed that Johnson's going to win, but he is fighting tooth and nail, and I think it's, it's anybody's bet which way it's going to go yet.
Look, there's an interesting philosophical question here too about who's representing the will of the people. Boris Johnson would argue, Greg, that that's exactly what he's trying to do, right? The people voted for Brexit. He's determined to deliver the people's will. The flip side of that would be, isn't the Parliament, the Commons in particular, the will of the people? They are elected by the people. Shouldn't we listen to what the Parliament itself has to say? Are they competing versions of who really has the people on their side?
No, I think the Commons has no argument here at all. The people voted for Brexit in the biggest vote in the history of the human race on the British Isles. All the major parties promised to honour the vote. They passed by a massive margin Article 50 legislation, which holds that Britain leaves deal or no deal on a certain date. That's why Johnson is empowered to do this. At the last election, the Tory manifesto said no deal is better than a bad deal. And with the Democratic Unionist Party, they won a majority in the Parliament. So the Tory rebels, and then Johnson won the leadership in a vote of over 90% of the rank and file, including a big majority of the MPs, and his runner-up also said, if we don't get a deal that's decent, we'll leave with no deal. Now, the Tory rebels are part of the British establishment, and they have despised Brexit from the moment it first came on the stage. And they are doing everything they can. They are tearing up the rule book left, right and centre. John Bercow, as Speaker of the House of Commons, has ripped up 400 years of precedent to allow backbenchers to take control of the agenda of the House of Commons. The government has control of the agenda. That's not undemocratic, because if they lose a vote in Parliament, a confidence vote, they have to go to an election. Well, Johnson is saying, OK, if you think it's undemocratic for me to do this no-deal Brexit, let's have an election on October 14. And if you win, if the anti-Brexit forces win, then that's plenty of time for you to revoke Article 50 or ask the EU for a long extension or whatever you like. But all the way through this, the fanatical Remainers have completely feared the British people. They've distrusted the British people at every point. And they are terrified now, even with all of the hatred they've created for Johnson, that he might have an election and win. And what would they do then? They'd actually have to leave the EU.
Just a final one on Jeremy Corbyn here. He, of course, has been pushing for an election for a long time, but now things may indeed be a little bit different. Within Labor too, there is, as you would know, a lot of nervousness about going to an election with this guy, Jeremy Corbyn. How torn is Labor in the UK right now?
Well, Jeremy Corbyn, I think, has managed all this pretty well because he's tried to let the Conservatives burn themselves to death. So tactically, I think he's managed everything very well. He is, however, a grotesque leader for any Western Democratic Party to have. He's basically an unreconstructed communist. He supported or he was a friend of every terrorist group going in the 20th century, FARC, the IRA. He describes Hamas and Hezbollah as his friends. He is the friend and shelterer of foul anti-Semites. He might give up the British nuclear deterrent. He might give up its permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council. He wants to nationalise massive swathes of British industry. Now, how grotesque is it that the establishment journals like the Financial Times and The Economist are happy to have Jeremy Corbyn become Prime Minister rather than to have Britain leave the European Union? The only reason Labor is balking an election right now is because Corbyn's ratings in the polls are in the mid-20%. Now, he was a good campaigner last time. He came back from a long way and ran Theresa May very close. But if he was 5 points ahead in the polls, Labor would be holding an election in a minute. There's no argument about principle here. It's just they're terrified that he might lose. But here's a final thought, David. If Johnson should get to an election and win, that will not only get Britain out of the EU, it will upend all the assumptions about politics, and it will probably mean the end of Corbynism. The Labor Party would probably be scared back closer to the centre of British politics. So the stakes in every direction here are absolutely enormous. We say this too often in journalism, but this is a truly historic week in British politics that we're entering on now.